I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to finish at 11, and then we're going to get on to the presentations and the interviews. Today's talk is in two parts. The first part is about my personal history with representation and drawing and the origins and the references and the meanings of it, to get you to the point where in the second part I talk about not so much the realm of representation, but the way in which representation and image making, which I made in the 80s and 90s, became actually informative, not strictly for how to represent projects, but how to think about them in terms of material life and form. And Malevich's Black Square, the first painting, the first image of any kind that was acknowledged as the beginning of abstraction, is important. It's a super graphic project, but it was also the project that he said was the spiritual enterprise, so all references are drained out in favor of pure geometry, where the observer can stare into a void, stare into whatever they may see, the ultimate kind of interface. That was 1915. 1913, de Chirico in northern Italy is painting in a style that he and a few others developed in terms of this thing called the metaphysical school, and the elements of the urban landscape and also the natural landscape that you see in paintings like this one called the Piazza. Architecture, very abstract, colonnades, square windows, shutters, chimneys that become obelisks, or that are obelisks that have a direct relationship to historical figures. And in fact, the representational nature of this figure versus the, let's say, architectural and stripped down functional nature of this comes into play in terms of the issues of representing content. In the background, you see the Italian hillside, some vernacular work, which is not too dissimilar from the urban setting, and the first of a number of gradient skies, because the deep subtext is, where did gradient backgrounds come from, and why do people use them, and why do you use them? Malevich's famous exhibition, the 010 exhibition in 1915, there you see the array of work. And when it strays from the Black Square here curiously positioned on the diagonal, actually, in the room, mutates into cruciforms, long horizontal bars, and of course his fragmented constructivist landscape pieces. His partner, so to speak, in this new world, Lissitzky, coming closer to architecture in these pieces called About Two Squares, which is actually illustrations of a children's book, oddly enough, for the revolutionary idea of nature, the political and cultural nature in Russia. And the Prown pieces were, for him, the proto-architectural element that you see here, mutating into 3 dimensions and so forth, with a horizon line. We imagine that to be a night sky and a deeply lit urban white field in which pieces transgress that landscape threshold and horizon line. At least one can read it that way, so that it positions us to think about what's going on in architecture, or a very, very flattened projection world, which also looks like a rotated ground plane for the towers to sit on. Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge, 1919. Super aggressive title, super aggressive form making, and what you get, of course, is the clean rectilinear frame. We all make drawings typically that are framed in that nature, and what we're tracking a little bit here is the relationship between the idea of the anxiety of the world, the nervous world that we all live in, the world of speed and progress and so forth. And even if you look at this as the horizon line, it's somehow a rotated drawing, and this was a planetary figure with architecture and culture launching into it. There's all kinds of ways to read this. Why black and red? Black, of course, is a color that absorbs all colors. White actually does too, but on two opposite ends of the spectrum. So black and white are the most intense colors. We don't think of them generally that way. We think of them as the grayscale world. And then red is the most aggressive, advancing color. So you take a wedge that's spiking into a white void with a color that's incredibly advancing. You multiply the energy, angst, and tension in the work. Bernard Tschumi is the most well-known, still today, the most well-known purveyor of constructivism and the Vahutamas school of work. This is Manhattan transcripts from the late 80s, and he was dealing in the mise-en-scene of film makers like Eisenstein and thinking about revolutions, scenography, episode, the body in space, the body in a certain kind of peril on the one hand. And you'll notice here he uses a gridded organizational field to essentially put movement, within that field. So the red square now becomes animated with the black figure, which at times falls out of the frame. Movement, which is tracked on a line, and so forth. So the movement is very dynamic and very energetic, but it's constrained to the idea of a projection field, while in the aerial perspective for La Valette from 1982, which he won over OMA, the field now in this perspectival aerial field suggests all the anxiety and movement that we saw in the Lissitzky pieces. So there's a tension between projection drawings, which can be loaded with movement and anxiety and energy and tension. We don't typically think of them that way. We typically think of them as being about repose, versus where do we put the camera when today, where do we put the camera when we make a perspective view of our project? Background, no background, et cetera. In this particular case, all the streets and the figure ground blocks is more constructivist grain that essentially makes the anxiety of the drawing even more intense. Well, here he takes the very same project and orients it in a objective vertical cabinet projection that we know from other architects, so as to flatten the drawing, to get away from anxiety and movement, to put the project into repose. And I'd like to say that this sets out some of the tension between the relationship between a plan, section, cabinet projections, vertical projections, and of course the axonometric and the anxiety of the perspective, because you are dealing with your drawing styles, you're dealing with your artifacts and objects, and every time you're thinking about making a drawing, you're probably wondering, should I detach it from the context and let it float free, or should I put the context in the project to ground it, which of course is a convention that we use all the time. So these pavilions, these red pavilions, which get deployed in a grid, in a straightforward grid, the one grid is superimposed on another grid. One image is about saying, nope, even though the pavilions are just sitting there in a grid, they're full of explosive anxiety and energy, and so he'll try to explain that, as did Lissitzky, exploring figures which touch the edge of the sheet, painfully kind of close here, but a lot of other pieces, of course, just float free within the landscape of the painting. And then a more objective sort of set of images almost in atlas form of each one, which of course they never worry about whether they're going to touch the edge of the page. And in Tschumi's project for, I believe this is the Tokyo Opera House from 1989, he employs the convention of more straightforward perspectival forms. We see a two-point perspective, vanishing points, one on the page, one falls off the page. But the rhetoric of the architecture with the vertical spikes of columnar systems, which essentially become three-dimensional lines, exposed trusses, and so forth, these things coming very directly, very openly, and not in any kind of hidden way, because of course Bernard always said red is not a color, but he also can say that because there was another text about red written, sort of decades ago from the Russian architects. And though it didn't employ the constructivist rhetoric of using red, this is a black and white drawing, of course, by Libeskind, whose micro-mega projects were related to this. Now, this little preamble isn't about, I'm going to show you the influences of what connected to what. That's not really the point. There's a certain amount of that, of course, and people like Kipnis and other historians have covered this. So I'll get to, I think, more particular points and more personal points. Zaha Hadid, her first major independent project, she won a competition which didn't get built in Hong Kong for the Peak in 1982, in which case what we see here, and this is a bit of a transitional image that I'm going to try and articulate, from an abstract graphic project, which almost like an illustrator drawing today, just draws a profile, fills in color, doesn't worry about gradient, doesn't worry about nuance, doesn't worry about the fall off of light, all those things you associate with rendering, whether by hand or by machine. This is Hadid's project, which uses a wide array of very desaturated colors. And so we're tracking vivid colors, primary colors, and desaturated colors, and they track and they go in parallel in many respects, and sometimes they overlap. And so in this particular drawing, this is, of course, the anxiety of the exploded perspectival field, the landscape becoming nothing more than a series of prisms itself, as it describes the landscape. There's enough contrast between what's designed and what's found, whether it's landscape or existing, but everything gets melted into a low contrast, desaturated world, and there's something curious about that. Let's step back to, let's say, the Illustrator project. So a number of years later, Mondrian and others in Holland, the Netherlands, working on what became known as the Style project. So the field relative to the rectangle, these aren't necessarily the most famous paintings by Mondrian, who, by the way, like Malevich, painted representationally before they made their big discoveries. No artist back then just sort of woke up, had never painted, and said, I'll make black squares. There was some filtering through, just like we do in architecture, of the I guess the rules of thumb and the kind of axioms that we work with. Anyway, so Mondrian introduces blue and red as primary colors out of the color wheel to be able to talk about not only black as a color and white as a color that absorbs all other colors, and red as an advancing color, but blue as a mid-ground color and yellow as a mid-ground color and blue as a receding color. Le Corbusier, actually, I had to truncate this talk to be able to get it down to our time frame. I could do 6 hours on all of this. Le Corbusier in the 40s actually adopts red, yellow, and blue, while in the 20s, he's working in desaturated colors in his villas, like the Jeanneret villa and so forth. So he he had an obverse relationship to some of this, and part of this is necessarily chronological. Part of it is just my reading of it. Anyway, the gray grid of the cellular frame, and then allowing this idea of color to animate an otherwise heavy, quote-unquote, brutal project. Later, John Hejduk, one of the New York Five, and they're always lurking about in this world of drawing and representation and kind of a modern trajectory. Hejduk worked on his Texas houses and his diamond houses, and then got to an even more hardcore Corbusian compositional technique infused with Mondrian, where you could imagine that it would be a question of translation, but if this were built, unlike the Bai house, which was built, you'd paint the plaster these bright colors, paint the trim of the windows black, anodized aluminum for the windows, and so forth. And so when I was looking at these drawings, not only fascinated by them as deeply coming from the deeply abstract point of view, but for me, I was sitting there translating what's the yellow, not that it's yellow, just being a material person. 1966, this is Craig Hodgetts, partner of Ming Feng. This is his thesis at Yale in 1966, where Sterling was teaching and Buckminster Fuller had come. This is when Paul Rudolph was still the dean, and Craig's project for animated super machine architecture was also influential. And while I didn't see this particular image when I was in school, and I couldn't source the images that I saw, the drawing style like this, while this wasn't Zipatone, this was another type of media, the fact that there weren't even any shadows, it was just a line drawing, and that the color coding and the color on the machine made it seem completely related to the way in which technology was presented to us as consumers in the form of refrigerators, cars, and radios. You just selected a color when you went into the store, otherwise there it was. And so thinking about color then, as I did here, was not so much about that I was part of the consumer world, but that the consumer world was the arbitrator of color in a way that architecture wasn't, because architecture had another narrative for its own sobriety. So this is a moment when pop consumerist graphics informed architecture. And there's a drawing of Craig's next to a poster by the famous Dutch graphic designer Wim Crouwel, who's now going to be 90 in December. Somebody I can count as a friend and a kind of a mentor in a way, after engaging with him over the last 20 years of talking about graphic design and how it relates to architecture. And also, in particular, he said, Wim said, if I weren't a graphic designer, I'd be an architect. I said the opposite, and his son actually is an architect. So this whole kind of culture between the way in which a poster could represent some aspect of the ambition toward architecture, one doesn't know exactly how, but that in terms of the method of drawing, an axonometric on a yellow background where the colors may or may not represent what it's supposed to be, but could be, I think it was very influential for me. I'm going to return back to Chirico, who was, let's say, when I was in school, Rossi was pretty popular, and I'm going to talk about Rossi. And so knowing De Chirico at that particular time was just because Italian rationalism and Rossi were moving toward the forefront in academic worlds and academic postmodernism. of which that was the intersection of a lot of things going on, both in Europe, but also Michael Graves moving away from what the New York Five were about. Anyway, so you look at these images. Curiously, they have the conventions of perspectival construction, but there's a lot of distortion going on. So, for instance, in the image on the right, the horizon line relative to the ground plane is very high. So our eye or our camera is in the air. We may or may not be in a building. We may just be hovering or floating. So scenographically, the point of view is moving to be able to describe, in a very, very stylized and distorted way, a certain urban space. And on the left, it's not really a ground plane. We know that more as like an exterior surface of a built floor that's projected dramatically above where the eye level would be. So we already see a certain amount of distortion, flattening, floating, taking away our position, our bodily position, and so forth. But when you look at the specific painterly aspects of the images, they're not strictly as painterly as you might imagine, because while there's nuances to the brush strokes in the flat surfaces want to take on a kind of fill level that essentially gets into Illustrator like paint by numbers. When there's more exotic forms, like in the foreground, the fluted columns and so forth, even the rendering of the fall off of these extrusions is super rigid. It's not painterly, it's only doing what it needs to do to describe form. And that, I would argue, makes this kind of scenographic painting rather than strictly painterly painting. Another example. And also the gradient sky. Of course, it's a setting sun against the mountains, the obelisk, the composition, the odd scale of all the elements and so forth notwithstanding. And then the sky goes into an odd gradient where it starts to turn into teal and blue rather than more oranges or reds. Now, Dalí, a number of years later in the next decade, among others, including all the surrealists, were deeply influenced by Chirico, who himself later on actually abandoned his work and abandoned the work that he did and even spoke out against it. That's the interesting thing about artists, is either they choose or culture forces them to really radically change their mind, and they have to go about denouncing what they did before. You can read many, many, many trajectories of artists, of which it's either a sad arc or something that for them is very political, polemical, etc. Duchamp being one other ones. We see a gradient sky. Horizon lines. The horizon lines are in there, of course, just to give us a plane to be able to put stuff onto, which, even if you think of Super Studio's drawings and so forth, this is the project. And so the project for architecture, especially in terms of the scenographic, is somewhere I'm going to throw in a horizon line, and it'll articulate a ground plane for which I place a building on it, or figures or bodies or furniture, and there'll be a clear objective reference to that. But in terms of how I treat the picture plane, the edge of the canvas, all of the internal, as in the case on the right, meta windows within windows, etc. The Surrealist project and Chirico's project was also, in a way, a corollary to the abstract project, which was, this is not what you think it is. This is something else. This is another world being depicted, and it hardly has to do with the forms of representation that we understood in traditional painting. So I'd argue that this is scenographic painting with the emphasis on the graphic. the abstract work of the Russian artist was obviously hyper-abstract and very, very graphic. Now, if you take somebody like Ruscha, who was born and raised in Oklahoma and migrated from Oklahoma to California, and we see odd things going on too in this particular, these are all famous images, I'm sure you know them. Gradient sky, I'm going to show you all the gradient skies so you can know where your gradient sky comes from. I'm just asking you, why do you use the gradient sky? What are the colors that you choose at the top and the bottom when you go in Photoshop or whatever you're doing? But mostly that there's a history that comes from that which is about being able to talk about atmosphere, because the gradient sky to our eye refers to the sun, especially the setting sun, and in California refers to a level of environmental waste like smog and so forth, which produce these kinds of things. We don't even see the ground plane. Obviously, it's a two-point perspective, but it's a perspective correction image because it's looking up, and typically when you look up, these lines are going to converge unless you do lens correction on them, and I don't know if you do lens correction on your drawings like in photography or in the case of plotting it, but if you do or don't, there's a huge difference in terms of what it means as to what the space is being described. So when you do lens correction, certain lines are the lines of the diagonal, and they cross the page and they produce a certain amount of intensity and speed and anxiety. And then meanwhile, there are the columns and the sign which agree to the edge of the picture, which essentially give it a sense of repose and sobriety. So if these were all converging in different ways, it would be a different image. It wouldn't be as calm and in a way serene here. The Hollywood, he did a whole series of the standard as well as Hollywood. There are iterations of each one. Ettore Sottsas in 1971, who later went on to found the Memphis group. Does everybody know what Memphis is? Shake your head, yes. Students, do you know what Memphis is? Okay. All right. This is long before he founded it. And so there's the gradient background. In this particular case, it's a full chromatic spectrum, and it doesn't describe the horizon line. So two things going on. One, I don't need your horizon line. I want to disassociate you from that, number one. Number two, I want to get the full spectrum of color because this was also, in many respects, the project of psychedelia, where Ruscha's is really about the laconic and the iconic as opposed to the psychedelic. So while I know I'm doing kind of visual and cultural analysis on the work, and that your work is sourced maybe from other places, but you'd want to know not strictly where things come from, but when you use a certain chromatic range, or when you orient the background to do one thing to, let's say, produce contrast, or to break down contrast and so forth, you're sending messages. You're sending very, very strong messages about what's going on, with the work. Moss, Moss? Do you know him, her? Michael Meredith, do you know that office? Raise your hand. Okay. Because it seems to me that they're one of the biggest references in architecture today, which was a way of drawing not only what I would imagine, and Michael Meredith and Hilary Sample talking about certain references, but when you analyze a drawing like this, where you've got the cabinet projection of somebody in the 20th century, whether it's John Hejduk, on the one hand, or Tschumi, so that there's no anxiety about how the architecture fits in the field. It'll get pushed into a kind of cubist flattened world. The perspective is going to give you a sense of dimensionality and diagonality, because you could also put the camera on the axis of the drawing and make the shadows redefine the axis of the of the building or the house. There's the gradient sky. It's got a mild level of psychedelia. It goes from the light green to pink. It's not the full chromatic range of Sottsas. Of course, it's only a ground plane. If they had put in a horizon line with the chromatic background, that might have made the project more surrealist. As it is, it just says this is all ground. This is a kind of map. The pitching up, the pitching up of the images in elevation, which are to restore the idea of the horizon line without the horizon line being in there, is also obvious, as well as the kind of articulated field of all those objects, not unlike what we saw in Lissitzky's. Now, I don't know if this is their analysis of the drawing, but this is my reading of it. There's the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus was built in I think Groningen or someplace in the Netherlands. I haven't been there. It's a shame that it was built because the project wasn't meant to be, I don't want to say the project wasn't meant to be built, but the project was very, very dramatically meant and designed and thought through in these cabinet projections, so that the stacking and the flattening of the irregular pieces, the wall, of course, which has tremendous dimension in one direction, only becomes an offset line. That when you see the photographs of the project, it only drains the project of tremendous meaning when you get into the scopic relationship of convention. And that's very important because what I'm going to show you in terms of a project that we had to draw quite a bit, we were never thinking in other ways other than the scopic relationship of the body. So Rossi has the strongest relationship in the 20th century to Chirico. You see in these particular drawings a kind of lurid chromatic range trending toward seafoam green, trending toward chartreuse, deep erotic reds, the brown of wood, black shadows, super important. So these drawings were super influential for me because they seem to already start to collapse the two references that I'm showing you. There's the cemetery by Rossi from the late 70s where vertical projection, multiple vanishing points, actually proto-surrealist shadows. That would be a black shadow if we were strictly describing the building, but the shadow turns the solid, dark, opaque building into nothing more than a prop or a piece of wallpaper. The grain and the speckle of the ink rendering, which when I did ink drawings, I dipped toothbrushes into ink and flicked the ink onto the drawings. I was absolutely trying to master Rossi's drawings. And then meanwhile, there's the pop illustrator project of Craig Hodgetts. So these are 30-year-old drawings, much older than you, I should say. And without describing what there are various competitions done in a late 80s, late modernist machine style, where plotted perspectives on the right of big, vast interiors versus elevations of machines tracking over freeways. Looking at the sky and the horizon line in very conventional ways in the drawings on the left to describe the project. These had to be handed in as competition projects, but the use of the heavy black shadow and the straight fill of the project where the one-to-one correspondence between the color and at least of the building was absolutely intentional. And because the building was drawn with very specific, though I would argue fake and abstract ideas, details, a steel building hyperarticulated, obsessive connections and joints. This is anodized aluminum, and that's a certain percentage of zipatone that I used, and this was going to be painted aluminum. And while the shadows wouldn't be typically black in the field, that's where, in a way, the work on the drawings has led to a certain isomorphism, I think, between design and the way to represent the work. Drawings from the next year. These are all ink on Mylar and then reproduced on film, and then a plastic color film cut out with X-Acto knives and put onto them. So there's multiple levels of, let's say, originals to them. Okay, in my 15 minutes left, I'm gonna subject you to something. It's a little bit of a, well, you only have to be subjected to it for 15 minutes, so it's not really that much of a test. But I have probably 50 or 60 renderings of one project. It's a project that we won a competition. It's the Keelung Terminal. This was the first phase. This is in Keelung, Taiwan, 1 million square feet, office building, cruise ship terminal, shopping mall, at least in this particular original iteration, on the harbor in Keelung, which is a city in the northern part of Taiwan, about 40 kilometers away from Taipei. And there was an international competition for it. There are various conditions for the competition for which we were obedient to them pretty much straight the way through, except that it's a two-phase competition, and it was also not anonymous. You submitted a portfolio. So this is a particular type of scenario where no one's guessing about who's done what, and you're essentially trying to make the argument that based on who you are as an architect and what your scheme is, that there be some legitimacy to it. Because of that, we chose to make the first round with images like this. All of them were like this, with white, white backgrounds. We used typography. The heaviness of the image in terms of black was used for roads and streets. Meanwhile, we eased up on the heaviness of the shadow, also because we had these warning stripe windows that essentially became black all around the project. So you can already see, on the one hand, in this particular case, we take a vivid color, we take a window pattern which is equally vivid and suggestive of many things. It's a fenestration pattern, but it's only one step removed from warning tape. And that produces a high contrast, and already we're suggesting that the building is really a representation of other kinds of phenomena, or it's a representation of abstraction, even though we're beginning to claim a certain kind of proto-reality, to the project. Okay, so we were lucky enough to get into the second round, and this was the project that we produced for the second phase. And what precipitated the dramatic change in the scheme were certain conditions on the site. The primary one was the site had to be thought of as two pieces. One, a terminal which could be built on an 80-meter deep swath from the water, and everything else had to be over here. So we obeyed. Not too many of the other competitors obeyed, and you always take a chance and you decide in competitions whether you're going to be obedient or whether you're going to slough off requirements and essentially try to produce the project which overrides all of that. I had a sense that with so many engineers and port engineers on the jury, that they would appreciate some sense of connection to the conditions of the project. So we ended up winning. Here's the terminal. A observatory restaurant, a giant office building, and parking and shopping underneath, and also a terminal that was hugely inflated with program, waiting zones, shopping, more like an airport, which morphed over time. Now, the thing about the project, I'll be very quick, giant project, different phases, radically different programs, radically different typologies, a lifted up giant office building that was itself cored out into a quirky courtyard project, which was lifted up on columns. Of course, the size of the columns were the sizes of office buildings themselves, to be able to see over the horizontal cruise ship terminal. Windows and declinations of surfaces that were pointing and doing different things in the site, since the site had so many different forces on it. And I also think that there was just an instinct to think about the project as not an essay in, let's say, site response or an essay in form making, but actually more like a novel. There were so many parts, so many stories, so many elements, and it turned into a kind of a surrealist one in a way at that. We had punched windows, we had double skin facades, we had straight up curtain wall with spandrels. So we had three major kinds of curtain wall envelope conditions on one project to be able to say different things, rhetorically. Now I'm going to take you through tons and tons of images. I'll go pretty quickly, which was, so we win the competition. We're under contract, we're under various time frames, we're dealing with typical forms of submission. The clients are reacting to cost, they're reacting to, in this particular case, mostly program. I'm showing you images, most of these have never been seen before. These are images for right after we won the competition, when the terminal was inflated like an airport with waiting halls, shopping zones, et cetera, as if you were going to transition and stay there for a couple of days. So all of the circuitry and various zones and levels, this is the main hall that you would go into, check your bags, and then go up escalators into various levels of waiting and shopping and so forth. And when you see these images, I'm shifting from these images, these are just standard V-Ray images. I'm not talking about these images as being exotic in any way. All we're doing here is essentially moving from the history of representation and drawing. You can see all of the aspects of color, and then looking at geometry, and in this case, an incredibly obsessive, erotic level of form making for its own sake, because none of the particular aspects of the geometry of this project were called for. That's where we obviously have to make a set of arguments about it. And mostly in these particular images, you're going to see images that have stand-in forms of, let's say, articulation. In the case of all we're doing here is making a solid line between all of the specific pieces of geometry. And when they start turning into material effects. So when you think about your thesis and you're working on it till April, it's this long elapsed time, and you're thinking about its trajectory of development of what it is, especially if you're doing a large project. I understand we worked on this for 2 years with a team of 6 or 7 people, so the labor is not what you can match, but perhaps the obsessiveness of the possibilities of design. So in every one of these images, you can see it as a relationship between, let's say, the real as we might imagine it in some very, very specific way, like there's a face flush glazed curtain wall, pretty standard. We use it as a clean, repetitive, almost scaffolding to look at or against the kind of promiscuous play of geometry elsewhere in the project. We'd also known by this time that the building was going to be concrete on the basement, concrete on the first floor, concrete and steel as a composite system on the second floor, and steel up above. So we were already tracking the rhetoric of the structural frame. and where we were going to perforate columns and where we were not, and what the logic of perforating the columns was. In this case, perforating the columns only occurred inside this hall as opposed to outside that particular space. So we were paying attention to these levels of detail, even though we were just modeling and rendering, with a level of insanity where we weren't thinking yet about how to panelize any of these kinds of surfaces. And some of this geometry we hadn't yet confronted in terms of the technical aspect, and essentially trying to play out the trust of our ability to be able to be rigorous with the geometry and the form making to get to the point where we could discipline the project. I've got 8 minutes. Well, I can do it. We have 785 sheets of construction documents for this terminal. It was 3 weeks away from starting construction, and then a wrench got thrown into the works and the project ultimately got canceled. So it was one of the largest projects. I'm not sure we'll ever see another project of this size in the office. So in a way, in the office, it represents a certain kind of mythology. It also is, every architect has these stories to tell, and I thought, good, we got this one so that there are less sad stories maybe in the future to tell. But I think we ended up throwing almost everything into this project that we had, because unlike our office today, where we're doing 15, 16, 17 projects, this was really pretty much the only project we were doing. And so it was like a thesis project. It was a moment of obsession in which we had to, I especially me, had to think about what did it mean to be aggressive with the exploration of the work and also edit the project all at the same time. So in some respects, the project is simply a meditation on 2 or 3 types of geometric conditions, truncated cones, frustum cones, cylinders, and flat surfaces, to get to the point where 97% of the project is flat panels, 3% were curved panels, which of course was super good in terms of the economy of the project. But the hallmark of our work has always been that whatever has radius conditions to it sends bigger messages, as though the building is much more wild and unkempt, or much, much more wild and exotic. But at the end of the day, it's not. Images looking, for instance, at the roof of the project, not only in terms of geometry, but also in terms of the system for its cladding. Here, early views of, we weren't sure whether the roof was going to be a panelized rain screen to create a pure sense of graphic enclosure. That's usually where you begin when you're not confronted with things like budget or water. I should go back and say that the roof ended up being a cowl zip roof, a standing seam roof, which the lines that you see were drainage gutters that were very strategically placed in the building to get the water, obviously, off the roof. By this time, the program for the kind of inflated building had been changed. It was really thought, I only want to process through this building and get onto the boat, since it's more like a floating hotel as opposed to an airplane, which you do not want to spend any extra time on unless you're in first class, which most of us usually aren't. So the space became more compressed, and the project then became a meditation on essentially wafers of space, of horizontal space, that were going to be articulated programmatically through different techniques. And in this case, the idea that the construction system was essentially on the inside going to be the same as the outside was very important. In this project, except in the offices, there was no drywall, which was a big mantra. I just walked in and said, no drywall, no drywall, no drywall, and we'll make it all out of metal panel to produce the let's say, spatially, I think a very simple project, but in terms of the specifics of articulation of panelization, that was obviously a big deal in the project because we're translating abstract colored surfaces into buildable systems. And so looking at how one large panel was going to be rolled on a conical geometry, and we started mock-ups to be able to legitimate that. Transitions between these types of panels and the grain and direction of the ceiling system. These are all typical things, obviously, that one does. But the main thing here was trying to understand the project as a graphic enterprise, which was going to carry along many of the ideas and arguments that we were invested in for many, many years. Waiting rooms, should we make the beveled coffer chartreuse? Should we make it silver? And I've edited out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of images. Phone booth, we have to design the phone booth, of course. We have to design the bathrooms. Who puts the camera in the bathroom? Only an obsessive person who doesn't build models and who wants to see the narrative of everything played out in every possible place within the building. Moving the camera just a little bit here and there. We never change the focal distance. It's always 30 degrees. We like to use the most normal lens, so we don't render in parallel projection, only rendering as the eye would see it. So in a way, again, not asking you to look at this particular system of rendering as an exotic thing, but really looking at this as a study in detail relative to the particular skins of the project space. A lot of the questions were about how wide and what color were the joints going to be that would essentially make the project look like an unfolded set of geometric surfaces, waiting rooms. Essentially, this was enough stills to probably make a movie. Here's the parking garage. Not too many people put the camera in the parking garage, but we did all the graphic design. This is the baggage hall. All the bags come off the boat. Very straightforward space, bothering to model the ductwork. Connections of steel to concrete in this hybrid first floor, drop-off zones, waiting halls, signage, radius, no radius, what kind of reveal, terrazzo on the immigration hall, of course, panelization, ceiling systems, more panelization, looking at big fat strokes like 10-point strokes, 4-point strokes, 2-point strokes, painted black, trying to make a new language out of the joint. Roof. Paving patterns, dotted line lighting as a joint to try to break down this 25-foot height. This is a very tall plinth, and so all of this was about mirroring and being able to create a graphic horizon line that was raised up in the sky. Done. Thank you.